as soon as I do it. Yeah, do you see it?
Oh yeah, I see it now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you want to talk about first? Allostatic load?
Well, I think you should ask me an introductory kinds of question.
Oh, okay. Hi, Dave.
I'll help you become a better moderator.
Well, I did do a little bit of an introduction. I actually, maybe I can even show you.
You don't have to show it to me.
Sure.
But I think what you should do is just start off with a lead question.
Okay. Ooh. Okay, so here's my first question. Dave, you travel all around the world on a year-to-year basis, and with this whole coronavirus situation, you're kind of locked down. What's that like? How has it affected your lab? And what's your plan to deal with this kind of situation?
Well, it's a delight to be here today and talk with you, Han. Yeah, coronavirus has really changed the way we work in the laboratory. For a while, for about 3 months, we were shut down. We couldn't do any experiments. Then gradually and slowly, we've been able to come back. We have a few people in the laboratory. It still is affecting our ability to collect patient samples, but I think we're overcoming those barriers. And in a month or so, we'll be able to continue our work with pregnant women, understanding what causes preterm birth, which you know is the leading cause of mortality and morbidity in the newborn period. It's the largest single cause of death in children under the age of 5 worldwide. And it's one of the most unsolved problems in the plethora of medical science. It's a real unmet medical need, and we're here to try to do something about it. In terms of my travel, my wife has been very happy that I've been home more than I have been in the past. And I've learned how to use Zoom a lot better than I ever have before. And we have multiple Zoom meetings nearly every day now.
Yeah, that's a weird phenomenon, right? Like, who thought that Zoom would be the way that we communicate, not something like Skype, which has been around forever?
I think Zoom is easier. You know, you have to remember everybody's password or Skype password to get them in. And I've had fewer technical problems with Zoom than I've had with Skype. So I think a lot of people are preferring to use it as well.
Yeah, less bugs, less lag, less hassle. All of our courses are being taught on Zoom now. Is it the same over there at the U of A?
Yeah, at our university this fall, any large course, and I think a large course is something more than 10 students. So other than graduate seminars, will be taught by distance using primarily Zoom at all the faculties. And a lot of professors are having to get their lectures up online to do this, and learning how to do this in a what they call an unsynchronous or dysynchronous aspect. So instead of everybody gathering at a certain time and 50 students listening to the same lecture, the lectures are recorded and they're online, available for the students to listen to at any time of the day that's convenient for them.
Yeah, that's kind of a shame.
How students are marked and how exams are given and so on. So the university's done a good job of working through this, and it has lots of supports to help professors who do this.
So yeah, your work is on preterm birth, and so I worked in your lab, and I had a really good time. You taught me so much about just the research process and all the things involved with going from a point of not understanding to a point where you actually can study something in a very sorry, Dave.
Systematic.
systematic way. Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the big things that you also told me were that there were social issues attached to the scientific ones. One of the things that you were talking about, one of the things that you studied and really made a positive impact on the world is your work on environmental stressors and how that it affects the risk of a woman who's pregnant to have a preterm birth. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, thanks. Most of my career has been focused on the mechanisms of birth or parturition, and then of course the major problem with it, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is preterm birth and understanding preterm birth. One of the things that we need to do to have a better approach to it is to understand what the cause is. Now, this is a syndrome, it's not a single disease, and a syndrome is differentiated from a disease because it has multiple different causes. So there can be genetic causes, there can be stress causes, there can be infection or inflammatory causes, and there could be just the uterus grows too quick, too fast, like in twins or triplets, the babies can be born early. Or if the baby has a kidney problem where it produces too much amniotic fluid and the uterus swells up, those babies can be born early too. So there are multiple causes for a preterm birth. And one of these that we think is important is stress. So we've done a number of studies over the last 14 or so years looking at stress. And one of these has been whether women who were stressed as young girls before the age of 18 might have had preterm birth. And we found that this is indeed true, that if women were abused or neglected early in their lives, that they had a higher risk, almost a doubling of risk for having a preterm baby when they were older, like 28 in the group that we looked at. And then this made us think about all the various kinds of stresses that women can experience, not only in their lives, but we learned soon enough that in the lives of their mothers or their grandmothers. So I started collaborating with a wonderful scientist from the University of Lethbridge, Gerlinda Metz, and she and I used a rat model. And we found that if we stressed a generation rats, what we call the parental generation, to our great surprise, they did not deliver early. But we remembered the words of a famous epidemiologist who gave a lecture here once. And we looked at their daughters, and sure enough, their daughters and their granddaughters gave birth early. And
So what kind of stresses are you talking about when you
these were mild psychological stresses. So the rats were asked we put pregnant rats into a bucket of water so they would swim for 5 minutes. They don't like swimming. And we put them into a plexiglass tube that didn't squeeze them or anything, but it was just close enough to the body they couldn't turn around, and they didn't like that either. That's 20 minutes a day. Only did this for 6 days in the last half of pregnancy. And we saw that their daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters had a number of stress behaviors, and that they delivered their babies early.
Just those two things. Wow.
Just those two things. And so we were always wondering why in this first generation we didn't get them to deliver early. And we thought it was because for them, they didn't have enough stresses. I mean, these two psychological stresses I just described were the only stresses that they really had. Now their daughters had all the epigenetic effects from this. Also, these rats, they were affected in another way. They were bad mothers. They didn't lick their babies enough. They didn't put them all together in one little pile to stay warm. After they were born, they spread them around the cage.
So these behavioral changes.
displayed behavioral characteristics. So their babies had an accumulation of stress. And we call this accumulation of stress something named allostatic load. That was coined by Bruce McEwen back in about 1993. And so the thought came to us, well, what about in that first parental generation? What if we increase the allostatic load? What if we added yet one more stress?
Wait,
So
people might not know what allostatic load is. Could you define
allostatic
it?
load is the wear and tear. It's like, you could call it an accumulation of stress. So if we accumulate stress, we have maybe we're out of work, that's stressful. Maybe we have a stressful home situation. Maybe we have a sick relative. Maybe we don't have enough food to eat. All these things can add up. And the accumulation we also call the allostatic or stress load. Now, we all have a threshold. Some the threshold's pretty low, some the threshold's pretty high. But when our allostatic load builds up to a point where we exceed this threshold, then we're at the risk for an adverse health event. So in a man like me, I could be at risk for cardiovascular disease or cancer or mental health issue. In a pregnant woman, she can have a poor pregnancy outcome, which would mean that including having a poor early delivery, a preterm delivery, or her maternal behaviors could be altered. She may not be quite as good a mom as she typically would be without this allostatic load. The other thing that controls where our threshold is our degree of resilience. And if we have a high degree of resilience, probably because we don't have a lot of stress, maybe because we have a very strong social support system, a strong family, we're healthy, we have good jobs and good incomes and so on, then the threshold is higher. So it takes a lot more stress load to cross over that threshold.
Wow.
If we have poor resilience, the threshold is lower, and it doesn't take much additional stress to get over that threshold. So going back to our rats, what we did was we thought that the allostatic load threshold for the first generation of rats was fairly high. So we added more stresses. We gave them, we administered to them a cytokine, a pro-inflammatory cytokine called interleukin-1, which is a mediator of stress responses. And we finally put them over the threshold, and they delivered their pups early too, and they had a lot of other pregnancy, adverse pregnancy outcomes. So this then intrigued us so much that we wanted to start studying human populations. And we needed to find situations in pregnant women or women even preconception before they became pregnant, where they might be really extra stressed. So we started working with Suzanne King from McGill University in Montreal. And Suzanne has studied women who have been exposed to natural disasters. So the very first natural disaster that she studied was in 1998. In January and February, there was an ice storm. And the weather warmed up, it rained, and then it cooled down, and all the rain gathered on the power lines and froze, and the extra weight of the water brought the power lines to the ground. And there were 40% of the population in Quebec was without power for up to 40 days.
40 days.
40 days without power. So you can imagine in February, not having your stoves work, or your light bulbs work in your house, or your heating work. And people wouldn't go somewhere else. They could make do in their house, but by putting extra clothes on or lighting a campfire or something.
Canada's cold. Canada's
yeah.
really cold. If it's cold enough to freeze the power lines and cause a blackout, oh.
So this is a real stress, in pregnant women. And then she looked and she saw that the deliveries weren't necessarily preterm, but they were 2 weeks earlier. And the mothers had high levels of stress, and the children born were very anxious. They had a number of interesting sad but interesting outcomes. And for instance, by age 5, there were more children who were overweight. By age 8, there were more that had high glucose levels and were starting to move towards type 2 diabetes. And by age 11, there were more children with high blood pressure than in a typical population. And the behavioral aspects were that these kids became much more anxious. And just a couple of years ago, in 2018, some of the TV stations in Montreal were running spots on these children who were then 20 years old. And they showed that lots of these kids whose mothers were pregnant during the ice storm 20 years earlier were highly anxious. And they knew that. And some of them were even applying to work in Dr. King's laboratory to study their own phenomena. So it was very, very interesting. And then she's gone on to show this in other natural disasters like floods in Iowa in 2007 and floods in Queensland, Australia near Brisbane in 2011. And then we ganged up together to study the outcomes of the fire in Fort McMurray, Alberta in 2016, when all 90,000 people were evacuated from the town, and there were about 1,200 pregnant women in the town at that time. So we recruited several of them, and we found that their stress levels were extraordinarily high as well too. So now we're very interested in how two modern social phenomenon and environmental phenomenon are affecting women during their pregnancy or even before their pregnancy, when we know that some of the antecedent early events occur. And they're climate change and the coronavirus. So we are interested in climate change in a couple of different ways. First of all, there's the immediate effect if you're a victim of a natural disaster. So typically you don't prepare for this, you don't anticipate it, but you know, a wildfire, which we see a lot of in British Columbia and northern Alberta in the hot summer months. You see these in California. Even today, I read that there's east of Los Angeles, 6,000 people are being evacuated because of a wildfire. And we heard last fall in North America, spring in Australia, about the terrible wildfires all throughout New South Wales and Victoria and Western Australia as well.
There's flooding in China.
Flooding in China. Yeah, mudslides, earthquakes, all of these disrupt an individual's normal daily rhythm, and it can cause multiple stresses. They can be loss of income. They can be food insecurity, loss of housing, maybe loss of a loved one, temporary dwelling in a camp or something like this. And then camp life itself leads to its own social disorder that changes the relationships between men and women, not in a good way. And all of these can be accumulation of stress. So those are one group that we can study. And the other group is those that are more sensitive to the gradual erosion of the environment due to climate change. So I'm thinking about indigenous groups around the world who are more sensitive to, for instance, global warming, where in the north, the permafrost is melting, and this is affecting their way of life. The ice pack is melting, and this is affecting the way of life as well. In other parts of the world, the forests are being decimated through fires or through logging. And this is a natural habitat, and indigenous groups that live that way. This is, they see this gradual erosion. And this adds on to the stresses that indigenous people feel anyway, due to a number of other social factors that unfortunately have been imposed upon them, or they've been subjected to. So they're particularly affected by the climate. Also, people living in relatively low-lying Pacific islands. There are many island nations in the Pacific where rising sea waters are going to affect their way of life, because some of the islands will become inundated with water, so they have to move. And then, you know, much of the world's population is located along sea coasts. And you can think of the eastern seaboard of the United States, for instance, areas around Miami, Florida, even New York City, parts of that, and all up and down the seacoast there. That if sea waters rise not a lot more than they are right now, that there'll be massive areas of inundation with water. Now, what's this going to cause? This is going to cause migration of people. These people are then going to have to go somewhere else to live. And so they'll be on the move, and then there'll be people in their, that they'll be displacing, or they'll be moving into inland rural areas, that the nature of the whole society will change. And so that's another aspect of climate change. In developing countries, in Africa, for instance, climate change causes migration as well. So in Nigeria, for instance, people near the seacoast are actually seeing more flooding. So they have to move, and they have to move inland. And then people inland and further north in Nigeria, they're seeing more drought. And so they have food insecurity, and then they have to move, and they move south. People moving north, people moving south. There's all this migration, and kind of can lead to conflict, and then that's another stress. So all of these are compounding one another. The people who are at the greatest risk are the most vulnerable people in the world. So
Yes.
if they had other vulnerabilities, like the ones we mentioned in Africa, who probably have food insecurity anyway, who live more in poverty than people in Western countries do, they have these risks. And so climate change is a risk multiplier. It's a health threat multiplier. It's not just additive. It's not just one more stress on top of all the other ones. It compounds it.
Yeah.
Now, let's add on top of that the stress due to COVID. And so the immediate stress that a lot of people around the world experienced was lockdown.
Yeah.
So lockdown was itself a stress. You stayed at home, you social distanced, and you couldn't work. So a lot of people, many people in every country lost income.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, you're on top of each other, and like you live in a 400 square foot apartment in, what if you had 4 kids?
Yeah.
Well, all be under the age of 10. And all of 6 of you were in this little apartment, and the schools were closed.
Yeah, it's
and
very
that,
common in Hong Kong for
yeah,
these packed families.
Absolutely. And so that adds another kind of social stress on top of that. And then there's the fear of the disease itself. You know, am I going to get sick? And what's that going to do? And, you know, if you have elderly parents, you worry about them getting sick and taking care of them. It's just yet another stress on top, but it's also another stress multiplier, a health threat multiplier. And so we think now that this is a problem that really needs studying, because the results, as I shown you over a generation from Suzanne King's work, tells us unequivocally that in the generation of children being born right now, we know for sure that their mothers and their fathers too are going to have mental health issues, are going to have stresses. And both fathers and mothers can pass these stresses on to their offspring, either socially, behaviorally, or through gametes. So sperm and seminal fluid are affected by stress, and this can affect the quality of the embryo that's produced from that union, and it can then affect the development of that child through epigenetic mechanisms.
Yeah,
And
I
those
think
children can be more stressed, and they can have many more health problems than their parents even have.
yeah, I think when people think about pregnancy health, typically people might think it's just a problem for women, but really it's a problem for all of us. All of us were born because of pregnancy, and if this is going to affect the next generation, what I'm worried about is that because the most vulnerable populations are at risk of these stresses from climate change and from the effects of COVID-19, then what that's going to cause is an even greater health disparity in the next generations to come. Because Suzanne King's work and your work clearly show that the stressors don't just affect one generation, but as you said, they affect the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. And it's not just going to be a wealth inequality as we progress towards the future, but really some people might live twice as long as other people. I mean, of course, that's already happening due to inequality of resources all around the world. But it just, as you said, it just seems like it's going to be, climate change is going to be an effect multiplier. And this is going to have an even greater effect on the next generations to come.
So we're not without resources, though, to combat this.
Yes.
And what we would like to do, and we would, first of all, this is a problem that needs all sorts of scientists from many different disciplines, from humanities, from social sciences, from the basic and the medical sciences, working together. Probably even from arts faculties. We need art therapists and music therapists. They can help us out as well. And we need to interact with healthcare providers and healthcare systems and with communities. And we've known from our experience in Alberta with the Fort McMurray fire, and I think we've seen it too with coronavirus response. The healthcare systems just really haven't been tooled up. They haven't been able to respond as well as they could. Well, we recognize what the danger is now. We know that, and the risk, and we know that it's not going to go away, and there's probably going to be more of it happening than less in the future. So we're prepared to work with all of these groups. So we bring together all these interdisciplinary scientists to begin to attack the problem, and we work from the get-go with healthcare providers and with communities to help design the research and to monitor the studies and then to use the outcomes. And we're trying to develop tools that will do two things. The tools are designed to predict who's at the greatest risk. Some people are at less risk, some are at more risk. We want to use limited resources and direct them towards the most at risk. And we want to identify risk early so that then we have other tools to intervene. And the interventions can occur early too, because we've learned a long time ago that early detection and early treatment is much more effective and much more cost effective to solve the problem than discovering too late who's at risk and treating them too late, and then the costs magnify and their effectiveness is of the interventions isn't quite as good.
So what are the interventions for this?
So first of all, we're trying to develop tools to address who's at risk. And to do this, we create cohorts. We're trying to create pregnancy cohorts. Well, we're fortunate because we have the 20-some-year-old cohorts of Dr. King, where we know what the outcomes are going to be. And now we're creating new cohorts based right now on COVID, but climate change too. And we can use them to develop what we call algorithms or predictive algorithms. And we take a lot of biomarkers, health indicators, medical records, and also we can look at the environment and the person's individuals standing within their community and their environment. And we can measure stress levels and put them all together in a great big equation with something called big data or machine learning. And then we can create very precise algorithms to predict communities and individuals at risk. And then the interventions, well, we start with various populations. So one of the populations that we're starting to intervene with right away are high school students, and so we call it youth and young adults, high school and university students and people of that age. And youth and young adults are the parents of the future. And we want to help build their resilience right now. We want them to go into the future with eyes wide open. And we can start developing resilience building tools in these young people so that we increase that threshold I talked about earlier. And that we can, and the stresses that they're feeling right now, we can start to mitigate those stresses and maybe reduce them as stresses. So last year, Greta Thunberg from Sweden was arousing young people from around the world about the perils of climate change. And a lot of these young people were coming to the conclusion that their generation had some pretty tough choices and some pretty difficult problems to work on. And many of them were already thinking of maybe not having children because they didn't want to bring children into this world. Well, what we want to do, of course, is work with them to find solutions so that maybe that changes their attitudes and reduces their stress, builds their resilience. And then amongst expectant parents, both the father and the mother, we are developing tools as well to reduce their stresses and build their resilience. Some of these include talking circles. In the indigenous world, we're relying on the wisdom of elders, and we're
not the wisdom of Twitter or the wisdom of Facebook.
The wisdom of elders, the wisdom of the community. You know, they excellent at forming talking circles and working out their problems as a community and solving their problems as community. That I think they're actually going to lead the way for the rest of us and inform the rest of us how we need to organize our approaches to solve these problems as well. And then, so that's part of it. Also, there are cognitive behavior therapies that people who are feeling really stressed can go through. And we've already put some of those up online, and we're going to be testing them soon in a new project.
How can people get access to these tools online?
Yeah, and there are some resources that are available here in Alberta, and we're going to test some of these amongst pregnant parents or expectant parents over the next few months as well. And so come back in 6 months, we might have some answers about that in terms of reducing stress. And then there are other therapies like art therapies are very stress relieving, music therapies, and we'll be employing some of those as well. So identifying who's at risk and then beginning to treat them. Also, we're working within communities. Now, sometimes when a community disaster hits, people want to do something. I know that you and I were working together during the year of Fort McMurray. and you went out and you helped the families who were dislocated and came down to Edmonton. You found them. I think they were at some of the major centers here at the university, and they were coming for relief, and you were helping them find their way through the maze and supporting them. And I started the study because these are all things that we wanted to do. And lots of people want to do things. So what we can do in advance of a disaster in the community, and you know, we can predict, like in northern British Columbia, there will be communities almost every year that have fire. We can assign tasks to people in advance, and they can help mobilize the community. Some people can fight the fire. Some people can find support services. Some people can find shelter and food. Some people can help families with small children. We can delegate tasks in advance to individuals, and this reduces their stress as well. And in the long run, it'll improve pregnancy outcomes, it'll improve people's parenting behaviors, and it'll improve the health and resilience of the next generation coming along.
Yeah. So it's so easy to say that we can reduce someone's stress. How effective are really these interventions? That's what I'm wondering. How effective? So you say there's so many ways to do this, through arts, through writing, through talk circles. So what's the kind of evidence that these interventions really work, not just on the short term, but on the long term?
We have evidence that women's pregnancy outcomes do get better from programs where pregnant women get together every 2 weeks during the last half of their pregnancies and talk about how their pregnancies are going. These can be women who have moved away from their home family areas to maybe a city or across countries for educational or job opportunities. And so they don't have their grandmothers and their mothers and their sisters and their aunties next to them, helping them through their pregnancy. And so they find support from other pregnant women who are in the same period of pregnancy as they are, and they can talk through their problems. And healthcare providers come in and have maybe a encouraging lecture, short lecture or demonstration, and then talks to them individually. And they exchange email addresses and Twitter and all that, and they can share their daily experiences. So that has been proving helpful. And other stress reduction strategies have had some good outcomes as well. What we're proposing at this point is obviously a major test to see how we can do it better, how we can predict those who are at risk much better than we have in the past, and how we can test various interventions and therapies to see which one of those is the most effective and the best way to deliver it. Now, a lot of what I've been talking about can be delivered online. So individuals who are in a stressful situation can receive the therapy over their phones or their laptops, and they can do it at a convenient time each day to that would help them when they can be quiet and they can pay attention to the intervention and follow along and do what's suggested. And all of these are very short, maximum like 30 minutes a day. So most people can find time to tune in for them as well too.
Can you hear this
Others
rain?
are more involved.
Can you hear the rain? Sorry about that. So to all our listeners, I'm recording from home, and unfortunately, there seems to be a level 4 typhoon on the way, and there might be a little bit of a rain sound. But sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I think I finished.
Okay. Yeah. So the services that are available. So you said that there is good evidence that these services can help improve pregnancy outcomes. what about places around the world where people might not have access to a lot of resources, and they undergo stress? And what can they do in order to reduce their stress?
Well, in Western Africa, for instance, we're proposing, one of our investigators on our team is proposing that we buy a bus and we train a team of maybe like young people, and they go from village to village with their roadshow. And they get people there involved, and then they get some local leaders to help lead the exercises, and then they periodically check up on them. So that's one thing we can do. Most people around the world now have a cell phone, and so it's not hard to reach them. And we can do it that digitally, and we can also do it the roadshow sort of thing, and train the trainers. There are women trained as nurses and paramedics that go from village to village in India, checking up on pregnant women. Well, mostly they do like a health assessment, but they can also do an intervention, a stress intervention as well, and lead the local people in those kinds of activities. So I think that there are proven ways that these kinds of activities can be administered, and then just word of mouth and people everywhere. Supporting traditional systems, like I said, the elders, the wisdom of the community, bringing it out in the open and talking about the problems is terrific. And then as a community, planning how you're going to respond if you find yourself in a stressful situation due to COVID, due to climate change, or due to one of these other ancillary things that are derivative from climate change or COVID.
Yeah. What about these people who are like, do you know about the preppers? The people who are always prepared for any situation. So COVID-19, they consider to be like what do you call it? Like a middle level threat, not something like an extinction level threat, right? But they prepare for the worst situations. And I think a lot of them are kind of like, this is just middle of the road. This is not as bad as what I expected. I think their stress levels might be actually lower. Do you think that something like that might be viable? Everybody just become more prepared for the situations to come. I mean, of course, not everybody can prepare for every situation, but.
Well, I think some of that's going to come naturally, because most people I talk to have agreed that we're all entering a new normal, and that life as we knew it before probably won't quite exist. I mean, in terms of pandemic and a virus, until everybody is inoculated with a new vaccine and there are no more new cases, we're all going to be a little bit more careful about our social interactions. That doesn't mean that we might not have rock concerts anymore or bars and restaurants being open, but we might be all wearing masks a lot more than we ever used to. We might just keep a little distance between people that we don't know, who aren't immediate family members. And instead of getting this close to talking to people, we might be 6 feet apart when we have a conversation with them. Maybe not shaking hands quite as much as we used to. Excuse me.
Yeah. Do you think that's actually one of the reasons why the rate of transmission in Japan is lower? Just because they don't have a culture of shaking hands. They just bow. Even in Korea, they just bow. They don't really shake hands that often.
The other thing too is that, which is really interesting corollary from all this, is we've noticed that there's a lot less air pollution in China, for instance, or other pollution producers, and that we might, what about the idea that all industry shut down for 1 month a year so we can kind of clean the air, and then it can fire up again.
The economists
so
are not
that
going to be
there
very
might
happy with
be
that.
a period of cleansing.
Mm.
Hard to do, but it would be an interesting concept to consider.
I mean, you're working on a company right now. What if you propose that to your CEO?
Well, we are a non-pollutant kind of company, so right now it wouldn't be much of a problem. We're trying to address this problem of preterm birth, which I've been referring to. And this was one of the reasons we got into all of our studies on stress and the environment. But preterm birth has been one of the most intractable health problems ever. It's a great unmet medical need. And we've known about it for over 75 years as a serious social and health problem, but we haven't been able to do much about it. Part of it is due to the scare back in the 50s of thalidomide, which was given to pregnant women to make them sleep better, but turned out to have disastrous consequences upon limb formation in their fetuses. And so when we think about treating preterm birth, we have to think about treating two patients, the mother and her fetus or her baby. And they don't all respond, they don't both respond the same to drug interventions. And something that might be effective for treating the mom might be very harmful for the baby. And so we have to be very cognizant of that. And then you only want to treat the people who are at the greatest risk. And so that means we need diagnostics. And we don't have really any very effective diagnostics that can identify for us the patients who really need the interventions. And oftentimes the treatments that have been developed over the past treat the last stages of the labor process, which is too late. By then the barn doors are open and the horses have escaped. It's too late to treat the problem. The treatments have been largely ineffective or just barely effective, not very good. So we need to treat the problem before it actually shows clinical signs. And that is difficult to then identify a pregnant woman who's at risk for that, because you can't really, without clinical signs, you can't really tell who's at risk. So we have to come up with very novel ways of looking more upstream at the biological cascade of events that leads to early delivery and identifying what they are, and then using those as our tools in biological kinds of tests to assess who's at risk. And if we can do that, and we actually, I think, have a very good plan for moving forward on that and being successful, then, and we also have new, safe, non-toxic drugs that are very inexpensive to produce, highly effective. They distribute throughout the body very easily. And we can now treat these upstream problems before they actually show clinical signs. And I think that we'll have some new treatments.
So before we actually talk about those specific treatments and the diagnostic, people might not have listeners might not have a full understanding of the scope of the problem. So for preterm birth, so why is preterm birth so serious?
Well, as I said before, preterm birth is the largest cause of death in children under the age of 5. It's ahead of infectious diseases or other causes. The rate of preterm birth in the world in general is above 10%, and it's rising, it's not going down. In Western countries, one of the factors that's been increasing preterm birth is what we call medically induced early deliveries or iatrogenic deliveries because doctors have found some other problem with the fetus or the pregnancy, and it's healthier for both mom and the baby to deliver the baby early. But that is only in Western countries. It doesn't affect developing countries where there are very few iatrogenic deliveries. And the rates are going up higher there. There's also various cultural groups that have a higher risk. So in the United States, African Americans have a very high rate, somewhere between 14 and 18% of preterm delivery. And this we know is quite certain is due to epigenetic effects from their parents, their social condition from just being Black in the United States, where we've heard over the last 2 months a lot about racial injustice. Well, they suffer that every day, and they can't escape it, and they feel it, and it affects their biology. Now, you can look at African diaspora in other parts of the world, and they don't have the same rates generally of high preterm birth as the African Americans do. So we know that it's more of a cultural phenomenon rather than a genetic phenomenon. In Canada, the rates are around 8%. They're around 9% in our province of Alberta. We don't really know why it's a point higher, but they are. And in developing countries, low and middle income countries, where these other problems I talked about before, where there's conflict, there's migration, there's food insecurity, all of them have higher rates, and the rates are not going down, they're increasing as well. Now, for the babies that don't die, then they're at greater risk throughout their lives for these other problems I've talked about in the past, these non-communicable diseases. They have much higher rates of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, overweight and obesity, and all three of those circle around each other and reinforce each other. They also have behavioral problems. They have cognitive deficits, and they can have certain kinds of cancers and certain kinds of mental health issues as they get into their middle years. So we want to prevent as much of that as we can too. The babies who are at the greatest risk, so pregnancy is around 40 weeks long. Babies who are at the greatest risk are those who are born just at the beginning of viability, which is about 21, 22 weeks, up to around 30, 28 or 30 weeks. They have the highest rates of morbidity and mortality. After 30 weeks, the morbidities continue, but maybe not the same high rate. The mortalities go way down because of, in the Western world at least, because of neonatal intensive care units. In developing countries where these neonatal intensive care units are not as abundant or readily accessible as they are, then still have higher rates of mortality. And even babies born as late as 35, 36, or even 37 weeks, up to 37 completed weeks, they're at higher risk than a 39 or 40 week baby for all of these issues. We're also finding that non-communicable and communicable diseases. So the coronavirus is a communicable disease. Heart disease is non-communicable. We're finding that they affect each other. So if you have heart disease or lung disease, you're at greater risk for the communicable virus. The virus makes you at greater risk for lung disease. So they work together in increasing the health threat. And so this is why we want to do something about this problem. It's probably the greatest unaddressed or unmet challenge in medical health.
And one of the reasons why you said that the therapies aren't really effective. I'm wondering how much of that is just because solving preterm birth is not about just keeping the baby in the mother for a longer period of time, right?
Right. That's correct.
Yeah.
So, right. Well, we do want to keep the uterus is the best incubator for the baby.
Mm.
Not only is it the best incubator, but the placenta provides all of the needs of the baby, all of the oxygen that it needs, and all of the nutrients that it needs. Now, while it's in the uterus, the baby's overall metabolic rate is kept at a lower level. The baby doesn't have to move its muscles. It doesn't have to breathe air, which requires constant work of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. It doesn't have to ingest food and then digest it. It's already given food in the basic building blocks, fats, triglycerides, amino acids, and small sugar molecules, so that it incorporates those directly and builds proteins and carbohydrates and larger fats, lipids out of it. If you ask a baby who's at 28 weeks to be born, it has to do all these things. It has to keep warm. It has to digest food. It has to breathe. It has to make all of its systems work 12 weeks earlier than they would actually be prepared to work. And so this is part of the stress that a newborn baby has to encounter. And we need to remember that. That's why the uterus is the best incubator, because the metabolic rates of the babies and the tasks we're asking its organs to do are minimized so that those organs can develop better until they're actually fully prepared at 38, 39, 40 weeks to do the work that they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. So when we were working together, I remember there was a paper published about this artificial incubator that was not a machine, but they were thinking about putting babies into animals as a live incubator, right? Has there any been further research on that kind of front? I haven't checked at all.
So one of the early experiments in this regard came out of a Japanese laboratory, where they took a fetal goat and they intubated it, and put catheters in it, and then they put it into a big warm tank, like an aquarium, of salted water, and then they took all the tubes and they passed them through a respirator which could add oxygen. They fed the baby these essential building blocks that I talked about, and they kept the goat going for days and weeks. So then, of course, you want to say, can we translate that to the human situation? So there's groups at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. There are groups in Perth, Australia. There are groups in Japan. And there's a new group at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto that are putting together various kinds of new, let's say, artificial placentas or artificial incubators that can be supporting these newborn babies. What they have to do, though, is that they're arguing that the lungs of a small baby, say 26, 28 weeks, where the alveoli are not fully formed and there's big air spaces, so you basically don't oxygenate the blood. The lungs can't do the job of oxygenating the baby's blood. But typically they have been doing was they have been letting these babies breathe twice the concentration of oxygen that we're exposed to. So we're exposed to about 20 or 21% oxygen. They would put them on 40 or even higher concentrations of oxygen. Now,
aren't they exposed to lower concentrations of oxygen inside the uterus?
They're getting lower now all the time. So what some of these groups are doing is trying to lower that even more. Just let the baby breathe normal air. And well, recognize that the oxygen the baby can breathe in may not meet all of its metabolic needs. What they're going to do is they're going to create a secondary oxygenator for the baby. And they'll hook up an artery and a vein of the baby, and they'll pass it through like what they call an extracorporeal membrane oxygenation device. And trying to improve these so that they optimize without causing the hearts of the babies to speed up, causing tachycardia, to actually breathe easier for the babies. And so they get more oxygen into them. And so those developments are occurring right now.
That's like the beginning of test tube babies, right? That's how it all starts.
This is a normal baby, born early, and we're finding ways that we can supplement its normal delivery to it of oxygen.
Yeah, I'm joking, of course. We got a little sidetracked. Let's first talk about the diagnostic that you're working on. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Well, our diagnostic was developed over the last 8-9 years by a series of trainees in the lab, including you, of course. And basically, every delivery that any pregnant woman goes through, whether it's a preterm delivery or a term delivery, there is a series of events that happen in the uterus. So the uterus is programmed through hormones to protect and develop the baby so the baby can grow and develop. And there actually are active agents that keep the uterus in this state of physiology and prevent it from contracting. Now, imagine you have an elastic band in your hand and you pull the elastic band out a little bit. The natural tendency is for that elastic band, if you let go, to snap back. The uterine muscle is a lot like that too. You know, I mean, the uterus before pregnancy is the size of an egg. And then at the end of pregnancy, it's the size of a watermelon. And so you're taking that egg and those muscle cells and you're expanding them to the size of a watermelon. So their tendency is to snap back. So we have to find ways to prevent that snapping back. And there are hormones like progesterone that cause that relaxation, so to speak, to occur and prevent that from happening. But then there is a time at the end of normal gestation, or unfortunately in some cases, early activation, where the uterus has to change from being pregnant to being parturient or delivering. And that process takes, we're not really sure, somewhere between 3 to 7 days, I think. And we actually have to change the biology of the uterus so that it gets ready to do the contraction, so that the muscle of the uterus can actually contract, the cervix can open up, and the baby's head can get out, and then push the rest of the baby out. So over that period of time, there's a series of chemical and biological reactions. And one of the earliest steps is that white blood cells from the capillaries that flow through the uterus actually migrate out of the capillaries themselves, and they bleb or crawl their way into the tissues of the uterus where they latch down, and then they release a series of inflammatory mediators. Some of these are prostaglandins, some of these are cytokines. And there's this constant increase in leukocytes, and they release these pro-inflammatory mediators, and these pro-inflammatory mediators begin to change the biology of the uterus. They stimulate the expression of receptors for contractile agents. They stimulate the expression of proteins that then form a series of connections between each of the muscle cells so that an electrical signal can transfer from one to the other easily and smoothly from the top of the uterus to the bottom and coordinate a contraction. And so this migratory event of these white blood cells is something that we can turn into an assay. We can take a blood sample from a woman who's pregnant. We can isolate her white blood cells. we know what the chemical signals are that they respond to, and we can, in the lab, set up an opportunity for them to migrate from point A to point B. And a woman who is not far, who's a long ways away from delivery, there'll be no migration. A woman who is very close to delivery within 7 days, there'll be a rapid and large migration. And we can easily tell the difference between the two, and those that are rapidly migrating, we know that lady is going to deliver within a week. So we can use that as a test. And then we have a therapeutic drug developed by Sylvain Chemtov in Montreal. And it is an antagonist to one of the key cytokines, interleukin-1, that is involved with this migratory process, but also is involved with upregulating or activating the uterus so that there's more receptor for the contractile stimulants, and it also stimulates the contractile stimulants to be produced too. And he has a simple, cheap, small peptide that can block the action of this cytokine. And that is like throwing a spanner in the works. And all these positive feed-forward systems that are moving like a set of gears are suddenly stopped because the interleukin part of it is stopped or blocked. And then everything else falls apart. Everything else, all the other ancillary events or consequential events are blocked. And so the whole process comes to a screaming halt, and preterm delivery is blocked. And we know it works in mice, and now we know that it works in monkeys, and we soon hope to test it in women.
So some people might wonder, so if you're blocking all of these events, you might be preventing preterm birth, but you say there are all these underlying factors that lead to preterm birth. Are we really stopping all of those underlying factors, and are we actually going to improve the outcome of the babies? So in these mice and monkey experiments, what are some of the indicators that these drugs actually have a good effect?
Well, it's a two-pronged question you just asked. First is like some of these stress studies I was talking about. So we can reduce stress, build resilience. Stress effects on prematurity are mediated through the cytokines. So if we reduce stress, we increase resilience. We're going to reduce the amount of cytokines that are built up in the mother so that her risk for preterm birth is decreased. We give these particular called allostatic receptor antagonists, so they don't block the binding of the ligand to the receptor, but they block the action of the receptor after ligand binding. They're biased or very selective. So an interleukin binds its receptor, it might stimulate 2 or 3 different intercellular mechanisms. We're blocking only one, and the one we're blocking is actually responsible for making more interleukin. So we're not blocking actually the pro-inflammatory actions of interleukin itself. So these are pretty safe because things like immunovigilance, we don't want to destroy immunovigilance so that if something else comes along that's a bacterium or another virus that needs an immune response to counteract it, we're not blocking those kind of immune responses. We're just blocking the one that produces more interleukin-1. And that's enough to stop preterm birth. So we're doing it at a couple of different levels. I mean, we're trying to reduce the stressors to begin with that would increase. But then if the interleukins happen to increase, then we have a secondary block to prevent them from carrying out. And this is why it's so safe and non-toxic, is because it's so highly selective.
I was actually looking up some of the papers in preparation for our talk, and I can't find the paper right now. But maybe no, it was actually a paper published by Nardi and Romero this year, and they were talking about I think they injected they activated the NLRP3 inflammasome, which is involved in so it's even higher up than interleukin 1 beta, because that's the right, as NLRP3 inflammasome is responsible for creating.
Yes.
Yeah. So and I think they blocked NLRP3 and they were able to prevent preterm birth. I think that's what the conclusion of the paper was. So why is interleukin 1 beta really the good target, the right target for preterm birth prevention?
Well, we think it's a good target because it's higher up on the cytokine hierarchy, because it'll stimulate the production of other cytokines like interleukin 6 and TNF alpha, and then there's a cascade event from there. So it's one of the first cytokines after toll-like receptor stimulation, and toll-like receptors then will stimulate the inflammasome. So what Nardi Gomez Lopez and Roberto Romero showed would have been consistent with the whole scheme that I've been talking about. Yeah. And it's one step a little bit higher. Where we are, though, is we're trying to target which are the specific cytokines that would have an effect on preterm birth. Now, so what we argue is that we stop the production of more interleukin 1 basically with our antagonist. Yeah. And we think that when you're developing a therapeutic, you have to think about what are its overall effects on the biology of both the mother and the baby. If you were to stop, you can stop preterm birth by blocking NLRP3, yes. But you're also blocking a whole path of cytokines that come after it. Yeah. So the innate response is now completely blocked. Do you really want to do that? I don't think so. We've done most of our work on interleukin 1, but we also have another antagonist that targets interleukin 6, which is one step below. And actually, I'm very excited about this particular antagonist because in all the experiments we've done so far, it's just as efficacious as the other antagonists we have against interleukin 1. But because we think it's one step closer to the key events that affect the process of the birth process, the birth cascade, we think that it might even be safer for mother and baby to target that. And experiments that we're going to be starting this fall are going to explore that possibility.
Super exciting. So, yeah, I think that's really significant what you were saying, that specifically the inhibitors that you guys designed, that they're probably safer for both the mother and the baby. You see how communicable diseases are just ravaging the world right now. If you're using like a NLRP3 blocker, then I can only imagine how suppressed your immune system is going to be. And then at that point, it's you got to pick your battles, right? But with yours, you don't have to pick the battles. And I think that's really significant. So I'm really excited that you guys are moving forward with the company. Do you want to talk? Is it okay if we talk a little bit about that?
Well, there isn't a lot that I can, I mean, not that we have secrets. There's not a lot that I can say. We formed a company a year ago. In the last 6 months, we got real professional business help to help develop the company because Sylvain Shemtov and I are scientists. He's a clinician as well. And we do what we do well, but we've never started companies and we don't have that experience. So these guys are terrific at this. And they've moved us along in a very deliberate direction and focused us. And we had to rethink all of the reasons why we think our products are helpful and useful and compare them to others that are out already on the market and indicate why we think they might be better, safer than those that are out there, or cheaper. And we come up with all the arguments. And by doing this, they arouse the attention of venture capitalists. So we think that we're going to have seed funding into the company, and this will help accelerate the development of the products and finish off the preclinical testing that we're doing in a variety of animal species, plus the in vitro kind of work. And then we'll have our discussions with the Food and Drug Administration in the United States and Health Canada. Together we'll develop a roadmap for how we will test these in small patient groups and what the regulatory hurdles might be that we have to get through as well. So our business advisors, our members of the team are just terrific at doing this. So I've learned a lot, and I've learned that I can't do very much on my own, and we need to have this team of a whole series of different kinds of expertise come together. And we're very, very lucky that this is finally coming together. I think over the next 5 years for sure, maybe even over the next 2 years, there'll be some really rapid advances. And one of the things we hope is that while we think we have really good solutions, we know for sure that they're not the only solutions, and we want to inspire other people that this is an area of not only investigation, but of commercialization that has a promise in the future and rewards in it. We want others to get excited and get into this business too.
Yeah, I'm wondering if any of our listeners are going to be investors, and they might hear this and they might become excited about what you're doing. I mean, I hope so.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about like how your team is very interdisciplinary. You're a master of putting teams together. That's one of the things that I really realized, that you're really good at getting people excited about things. You're good at finding the right people for the job, right? And I think that's really important in academia. So maybe we can switch gears a little bit from your work, but to kind of your working style. I think people might be really interested in hearing about that. So,
well, this is interesting. There were two necessities that kind of moved me into organizing interdisciplinary teams. The first was that for 17 years, I led the Perinatal Research Center here at the University of Alberta. We had about 44 members, and they were highly enthusiastic, top scientists, and individually they received a lot of awards and grants. But the university didn't give us very much organizational money to do this. And so to raise money to bring all these people together, we had to learn how to go after group grants and team grants. And there's not a school to learn how to do that. So I learned by trial and error. But as the director of the unit, I felt it was my job to get interested in this. So we did have some successes. We got small group grants. We got training grants that brought together a lot of people and trained about 65 really outstanding people over the course of 6 or 8 years. And then some larger team grants as well. And correspondingly now, federal and other funders have been seeing benefits in teams and interdisciplinary teams because they can tackle bigger problems than an individual investigator and an individual lab can address. And so they've been putting money from the federal government of Canada, some private funders as well have been putting money into these team efforts. So then I was able to get an international team together from money offered back in 2012 by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Seattle Children's Hospital. And that was very effective, and that led to some of the diagnostics and therapeutics that we've been talking about. And then more recently, we're trying to develop teams that look at these social and environmental effects that cause stress and concern for parents and affect the health of the parents, and that subsequently affects the health of their children and their grandchildren. and that's called the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease. And I've been trying to put teams of people together to attack some of these problems like COVID and the climate change, and food insecurity and other kinds of stresses. And I think I'm getting better at it.
You're amazing at it. You're better than anyone I know.
Find it to be fun, and one of the wonderful things about being a professor is that you get to work with other professors, and they're all interesting, and they all have interesting research projects and stories to tell. And what I like to do is find the opportunities for them to come together and introduce people to each other who may have never met each other before, but
right.
Synergistic actions that if they were to get together, they could enjoy and benefit each of their research enterprises. And overall, then you put the whole team together and you can address really terrific, some of the top problems in Canada or in the world today. And it's exciting, it's fun too. It's a lot of work, but I think I'm getting better at it. And I'm also learning the management and the methodology of it. And the methodology is changing. And even over this summer, I've come to the conclusion that we need to do like we have in our company. We need to get professional managers into our teams. I mean, the dollars are big enough so that they get paid decent salaries. And it's jobs that can last for 6 years or many more years. And we need to develop a cadre of individuals who are particularly skilled at this, just like we have over the last 20 years developed a cadre of individuals who are good biotech startup CEOs and diagnostic officers and therapeutic officers and so on, and chief scientific officers. So we need to do that for these interdisciplinary teams as well.
And it's not just interdisciplinary, it's international. You worked with people all over the world. And one of the reasons why that's so important is because the issues that you're tackling are not just local. They're global, and these global problems demand a global solution.
That, and I have the fun of working with the best scientists in the world.
Yes. Any shout outs? Any shout outs to?
You know who they are.
Okay. So I think like a social issue that's tied to this that I can think of is that these days international collaboration might become harder to do, particularly as countries start competing for intellectual property, right?
If there is actually, I might disagree with you there. I think that countries are finding that international collaborations are quicker solutions to some of their problems than just funding individual scientists within their country alone. And so there are more mechanisms available for international collaboration. One of the best is in the EU, the European Union. They now have a series of large team grants that cross all of the member states of the EU. And you can even bring in Canadians on those kinds of grants as well. And the Canadian government is now, in its wisdom, finding that some of its national funding programs for teams should include international people as well. For a couple of reasons. The first is that they recognize that the problems are global problems and not just, they just don't pertain to Canadians alone. Very few problems that we have that aren't, in fact, I can't think of any problems that we have that aren't shared in other countries.
Oilers lose, they're on a bad streak.
If you can bring in a world scientist from Australia or England or the United States, you just decrease the time until you find a good solution to your problem, because you've got the best people in the world on board, and good people attract other good people. So you build the best team possible. And then also is leveraging. So, no one foundation, no one government funding program can provide all the money that you need to truly address and solve a problem. You need international collaboration. So if the Canadians can seed fund a program, but then the Americans, the Europeans, the Australians can match that money, and or agencies like the Gates Foundation or the World Health Organization or other can add their expertise, then you can build a stronger program, and you have more funding partners as well too. So that's an incentive for international collaboration. Organizations like the World Health Organization are terrific at identifying what the key problems are and bringing together the experts. They don't have a lot of money for research themselves, but they can act as catalysts, and they can draw attention to the top priorities, and then they can stimulate other organizations to bring funding or their top scientists to address the problem.
So what's your opinion of the U.S. Decision to withdraw from the WHO?
I think it's going to be reversed.
Okay.
It was a temporary decision. I don't think it takes a year for the full withdrawal to occur, and within that year, I think a lot of changes are going to happen, so that that decision will be reversed, and the United States will go back to being, I think, the largest supporter of the World Health Organization, and they'll assert their international leadership role, and they'll learn that they can't affect policy if they're not a player in the game. Yeah. So if they're out of the World Health Organization, then they're also out of affecting World Health policy as well. And I don't think that they would feel comfortable like that anymore, and they'll get back in the game.
Yeah, really hope so. I think the World Health Organization is a necessity. Or an organization like the World Organization is a necessity.
And we need these coordinating bodies. They're not perfect, but no human enterprise has ever been perfect. But at least they admit their shortcomings, and they put effort in place to correct those shortcomings so they don't happen the second time.
Yeah. A lot of the times when they put out the policies, it does take a lot of time. Some people, it's a complex issue. People might think that they have political motives, or they have economic motives. I'm not sure. But when you do think about these global problems, you do need a global solution. And I said that before, but especially with the ability, like 100 years ago, you wouldn't have this ability to jump from country to country and potentially spread disease between countries. And I think we're learning really quickly with the coronavirus that you do need an organization like the WHO to respond on a global scale. But the problem is that the COVID situation was actually the one that undermined a lot of people's trust in the World Health Organization. It's kind of like a paradox.
I think in this case, there were a lot of politics that got in the way too. And I don't think that all the countries involved were as forthcoming and honest as they should have been as early as. And so an organization like the World Health Organization that has to get along with its member states was victimized, and it can't take all the blame. I think that if you look at what it did though with Ebola virus in Africa, that it was Johnny on the spot, and it had a terrific response that contained the spread of the virus in a magnificent fashion. So they've got some real successes that they can look back on too. And in that case, I don't think the political situation was as got in the way as much. And they were lucky too, because the Ebola was isolated to countries that aren't high travel countries. You know, and it didn't occur in a dense population like coronavirus beginnings did. And I think the right strictures were put in place early enough to contain the virus. But I think the World Health Organization can take a lot of credit for what it's done with Ebola and Zika and so on.
Yeah. Maybe we should switch gears a little bit. This topic's getting a little bit depressing. What I also wanted to talk about, not just your working style, but also your teaching style. So you've had so many students in the past. A lot of them have been successful. I learned so much from you, and I honestly wouldn't be the person I am today without you. What is your personal teaching philosophy, and how will that, I mean, you're going to keep taking students, so maybe some students might be interested to hear this if they're planning to come into your lab. So what is your teaching philosophy?
Recruit the best students I possibly can. People who are self-starters, who are as excited about the work as I'm excited about it, and then get them started, be a guide, and get out of the way, and let them do their own work. Mm-hmm. You know, be there for support when they need support. Be there to buck them up when they feel sad. Be there to offer advice when it's necessary or asked for, and to let them know they're doing a terrific job, and provide the basic support in the laboratory in terms of a good question, a good level of materials and equipment, and trained technical staff that they can go to for advice, and then let them find their own way. And sometimes the paths are very crooked, but they all develop, and then offer them opportunities along the way to share their results with the world. And most, up until this spring with the lockdown, all of the students had the chance to go around the world to tell their stories and to meet the top scientists in our field around the world, and get the feedback from the top scientists. That's part of it. To publish in the best journals they can possibly publish in. To introduce them to the culture of this science. So I introduce them to people who can help them in their careers, who can give them advice about their research, who might be potential employers or supervisors for the next level of their training. And I think acculturation is a very important thing, so that, and we work on more of a horizontal level than a hierarchical level. We're more colleagues than worker boss, and to let them know as soon as they're ready to know that they're now a member of the scientific community. So you publish a paper, you attend a meeting, you discuss your work, you get engaged and you get excited about it. You're a member of the scientific community. You've transitioned into that scientific community. And to let them know that they are a member and they're a valued member doesn't, it's not important what degree they have behind their name or what job title they have. What's important is the quality of their question, how thorough they examine it, and how they interpret their data, and what they think the future work is about that question, to move it forward so that it has a good outcome. It So a good outcome would be that if you solve one question, you should be able to ask at least two more good questions, or that maybe it can be translated in some way to affect practice or policy. And that it makes a difference, and so that the work that you do changes the course of the field, and other people say, well, that's a great outcome. I'm going to follow along on that line of thinking.
And I think you did. From my experience, you definitely did that for me. You inspired me you made me feel like I was a part of the scientific community from a very early point, even though I personally didn't think my results were actually that important. But that really inspired me. And you even went further than that. I can't speak to other students, of course, but for me, while I was studying during my master's, I did have a very challenging period. I had this period where I was depressed for a few months. And there were some times when I didn't show up for work. There were some times when I wasn't very communicative. But you never really held that against me. And I don't know if I'm just so grateful, because in my mind, the normal response would be, say, you didn't show up for work, and then you try to manage that, or you try to blame the person, as I actually did feel from a lot of the people close to me at that time. You were actually one of the only people who had my back, and I'll always be grateful for that. You helped me. You helped me find the support that I needed. Yeah, it's just, I really wouldn't be the person I am today without you. And I think what you said is about your teaching philosophy is correct, and that does make a good scientist. But I also think one of the things that make you an unbelievably amazing supervisor is that you go beyond the science, and you make us feel like we're human beings sometimes, and you treat us with respect. You treat us with honesty, and sometimes you're the one support that we have. And just thank you, Dave.
You know, it works both ways, and I gain a lot from you guys too. And you enrich my life and make it worthwhile. And all the work that we do is just a result of that. And you produce incredibly good results that help move the agendas forward. Our company wouldn't be where it is without your good work. Our science, our grants, all of that wouldn't be where they are without people like you. So thank you.
How long have we been doing this? We've been doing this for about an hour and a half, I think. Is there anything else? Because we talked about some topics that we were going to talk about.
Hour and 40 minutes.
Hour and 40 minutes. Wow. Didn't feel like that.
I think you've got a lot of material. You might edit some of it down to 45 minutes or something. Okay. We're an hour and 40 minutes into it.
Well, thank you, Dave. You're amazing, and I hope that we can come together and have a beer one day again in the near future.
And you know, when you were with the lab, you were the lab food, and
I was
inspired about all kinds of different cuisines. And now that we're done, and this part you're going to edit out, but I'm on my way with my wife to H Mart to do our shopping.
H Mart is amazing. I actually went. I went before I came here for full-time studies. I went with my parents to H Mart. They have a restaurant there. They have a bakery there. They have everything that you would want.
I like T&T too, but we'll go to one of those two places today.
H Mart is better, of course.
Yeah, the food is better, I think. We're at the food court's better.
Yeah.
All right. It's been lovely talking to you, and we'll get together now on those papers.
Yes, absolutely. And if anybody wants to contact you about your company and your diagnostics or your therapeutics, or if they just want to ask a question, how can they contact you?
Oh, I'm at dmolson@ualberta.ca. That's my email.
Okay. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.